Okay, when we left off, we did some cool stuff. We had created um, our view model. We hooked it up to our linear list, and we were able to dynamically add live data sorted as well to our application. Now, the one thing we didn't actually test was our try catch. And full disclosure, I actually haven't tried this outside of this. Usually, I prep everything before I um, uh, do it in class, but why not? Let's try something a little wild. So if we add another document here that doesn't match our view requirements, so name, delete me, and we'll give it a rating. And I'm just going to leave the data type as string instead of a number. So I say it's got a string of 3 and hit save. What happens? Okay. So it returns 7 elements from the database. One of them's invalid though. And we can see in our log, the delete me one is basically the source of our problem. So going back to the question earlier, what would you do? Well, in this case, I think I'd log the bad one, and I'd probably potentially log it under something a little more severe than info. And I'd probably put a different tag on it from DB response. I'd put something like, invalid record or something like that. And so now that I know that that one's, not good, I could either delete it or I could fix it. But I'm just going to delete that. Ooh, I don't want to delete all restaurants. I just want to delete this one. So delete that document. And you can see it triggered a reload. And when I go back, everything looks great in our app. So you can see how you can really shelter your users from bad data. I'm just so excited about this. It's good stuff. All right. Now, I believe earlier, Ridish had said that my design looked awful, and he made fun of it, and he teased me, and he's going to expect a good grade still. It's unbelievable. But it does look awful, so he was right. This isn't our typical design. We want something a little flashier. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do things in Android, as you would imagine. And one of the utilities that they've created to give a little bit more styling to things like this, where you're reading from a database, is called a recycler view. And let's jump into our notes for a second here. So we've talked about the view models. We've added our dependencies here for our view models. And we've created a custom view model class. Yeah, some great animation in there, right? So again, I'm just trying to really call out what's happening with each of these little snippets of code. And this is getting our stuff from the database and looping through. So nothing too interesting here that we didn't already talk about in class. So I'm not going to go through it again and again. But again, if you're watching this asynchronously, maybe this would help you a bit. Okay, so the recycler view. So here we've got bland, and here with the recycler view, you can see that we can get a much better looking result. So we could have something that kind of looks a little bit like a linear list, but includes like a rating bar, so we can at least visually see what the objects are. Or personally, I prefer this style, though it takes up a bit more space, which is almost like creating. They're not buttons, but they almost visually look like buttons. And when we click on them, they'll change color briefly, and it'll just look a little bit cleaner. So that's what we're moving towards. So the recycler view is it's a really interesting design. So what we've seen so far is that our layouts are handled in XML. And the recycler view, what it does is, you can see these are placeholders, item 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, right? Inside each of those, we can have a custom XML file. So we literally have an XML file that gets inflated into another XML file and populated from the database. So that's how we get like this really strong control over exactly how each of these little elements will look and feel. And to do it, there's a few classes that I'll tie together, and I'll try to go through each of those in today's class. And I mentioned this at the start of class. When I first learned this, I struggled with it. So if it feels like it's overwhelming or it's confusing, stop and ask me questions. I'm going to try to go through it as detailed as I can and try to relate it to Java, right, which is probably hopefully a little more comfortable in terms of how the code is written. So our recycler view is our XML. So it's basically our placeholder of where all these dynamically created little displays will go. The adapter, I said here, it binds a data set to the views. So the adapter is what's connecting things together, so to speak, and in terms of putting the data from our database into these objects. And the view holder is a special class that we're going to create that connects the view item, the XML items, with our class, because we kind of have this nested XML layout. It's hard to describe in words. It's easier to show in code. If you want to read, I put the reference here for the actual developer pages. Okay, let's start with, before we get too far into these, let's start with actually the layout files, because I think that's the easiest part. So I'm going to right click on my app, and I'm going to go down to activity, and I'm going to choose an empty activity. And I'm going to call this recycler let's call it recycler list activity. Finish. It's going to add it to GitHub. Our Gradle synced. And I might as well right away do the quick set up our view binding. So I'm going to say private So remember, all of our binding classes start with the word activity, and then it's going to be recycler list binding. And then inside our onCreate method, we're going to say binding equals activity recycler list binding inflate layered inflator. Okay, so now when we come back to our activity Kotlin class, it'll already be ready to roll to talk to our layout files. So now let's go over to the layout side. So I'm going to go into resources, layout, and we've got our activity recycler list layout. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a text view, drag it on. So in many ways, this is going to be very similar to our linear list layout. And underneath it, I want to put my recycler view. So the recycler view, it's under, is it a container? It's a container. So under containers, you can grab a recycler view and drag it onto the scene and let go. Okay, so far we've got a text view at the top and a recycler view. Doesn't look like much. That's all that we need from the design side. So I'm going to go to split mode now. And in here, we're going to make a few changes. So my text view, the text I want here is the same as the text we had from our strings from before. So didn't we have one called like restaurants? Thought we did. List of restaurants. Okay. So now it says list of restaurants, and I'll give it our text size of heading. So text size, heading font size. There we go. And you can see our recycler view. It's overlapping, right? It's not constrained in any way, and that's why it's giving us some complaints here. So I'm just going to get rid of where it says tools. I'm going to say start to start of parent, end to end of parent. So that's going to anchor it on the left side and on the right side. And I want the top of this thing to be the bottom of my restaurant text view. Okay, so now it's starting to look a little bit better. And I'm going to get rid of where it says text view 2. I'm just going to call it text view. And what else do we want here? So layout height and width. Right now, these are hard-coded to very specific dimensions. And I'm just going to say for the width, match the parent. So make it as wide as the parent. I don't care what the phone is. But you can actually see it goes down beyond the bottom of this phone. So I don't want it to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it 0 dp. And what that means is it's sort of like match parent, but match parent will go to the full width of the parent. So if I said match parent here, it goes to the very top of the parent and the very bottom. If you do 0 dp, it will basically use the space that's available. So slight nuance difference there. And maybe we'll put a little margin on this. Okay, so in the group chat, there's a question that says, I don't get any of those items. It's just a white box. Oh, so you don't see item, 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 item like that? It's just a white box? Huh. I don't know. My short answer is I don't know. But let's keep playing and see. You sure you grabbed the recycler view? So like the Android X recycler view .widget.recycler view. Okay. Whenever I've done it, I've always seen the items. But let's keep going and see what happens. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add an ID. So I'm going to say ID, and I'm going to call this vertical recycler view. Because later we're going to build one that's a grid, so I want to have a slightly different name. And the other thing that we need to do, since we do want it to come off as vertical, is they have these layout managers. And you can see there's grid layout, linear layout, and a staggered. I haven't played with staggered, but we're going to choose linear layout for this. And I'm just going to commit that all to GitHub. I don't know if this might be too big to paste in the group chat, but try it. No, it didn't look. It looks like it got cut off. So here's a link in the group chat. You can take mine and literally just copy all of it and paste it right over top of yours. If anyone's having any issues, you can try that. The other thing we might need to do for yours, Eric, is there is a Gradle for the recycler view. So let's try updating that as well, just in case. I don't think it's called yet in the layouts, but just in case, let's update it now. So I'm going to go to the Gradle scripts, the module level Gradle. I'll just copy it. Paste that in the chat. Make sure to hit sync now. So we've got our activity. We still need to connect it to our view model, but we've got our activity and we've got our layout file. But what we haven't done yet is explain to our layout file in the recycler view what each item looks like. And that's what we're going to do next. So to do that, I'm going to go into my resources folder under layout, and I'm going to right click. So this is different. Every other time we've had a layout file, it's always started with activity, and it's been auto-generated when we create a new activity. So I'm going to go into resources, layout, right click, new layout resource file. And typically you'll see the naming convention is they start with the word item because it's an individual item in the recycler view. And I'm going to call this one, so new layout resource file, and I'm just going to call it item restaurant. Anyone else can say the same. Add it to GitHub. And by default, whenever you create these XML files, it starts off with a constraint layout. But in this case, what I actually want to do is have a linear layout so that things get displayed horizontally. And rather than type it all out, I'm just going to give it to you. I'm just going to paste it in here. And I'm going to go to this paste of code. And we'll paste it in there. And I'm going to put that into the group chat. So if you're watching this asynchronously, you can go to my GitHub and grab this file. And it's got a couple errors, but we'll fix those real quick. Let's go to the split view. So I'll give you a minute to paste that in to your item restaurant XML. And so what do we have? So at the top here, it says it's a linear layout. It will match the parent in terms of its height and its width. And the orientation is horizontal. So as I add elements, they're going to go side by side. And I put a little margin in here. So let's see, let's call it standard margin. And this dimension here we don't have yet. So let's just do 200, I think I did 250 dp. And the reason that I'm doing a fixed width here, normally I would do everything dynamically. But in this case, I want to have the name fit in this space and the stars off to the right. And I want all the stars to line up. So I'm going to make the width of this text view fixed. So the stars will always line up at the same spot. And here you see that it says tools text equals McDonald's. What that means is the word McDonald's will only show up in this view, and it's really just here as a placeholder so we can get an idea what this is visually going to look like. I've set the gravity to be centered vertically, so within this little text view, it's going to be centered up and down. And then text size, we can make that our heading. No, maybe that's a bit big. So I think it was 20 SP. Let's put that as a resource file and call it regular font size. And now that's the text view. This rating bar, we've never actually used the rating bar before. If I go to design view, it's one of the widgets, I think. Yeah, rating bar. So under widgets, there's a rating bar. You just drag it in. And you can see here, I just said wrap content, so make the container holding it as small as it can be. There are different styles of rating bar. I took the small one. There is a large one that kind of looks goofy big, so I kept it as small. And again, I centered it vertically, and you can choose the number of stars. So since we only allowed our users to enter a number between 1 and 5, the number of stars is going to be equal to 5. So that's the item layout. Yours errored out from a lack of constraint. So if you're getting that on the item activity, you're probably still using the constraint layout, not the linear list layout. So the linear layout doesn't have any constraints. So you can just paste that code from the paste bin completely over top of what you have. Hopefully that'll work. All right, so yeah, the text view shouldn't have, again, see here on line 2, it's a linear layout. So there's no constraints to add. So if you're watching this asynchronously, I'm just going back and forth with the chat. There was a complaint that they were getting an error that that this wasn't constrained. Okay, beauty. All right, so that's our item. So what happens is this item will get plunked into, and plunked is a technical term, by the way. If I go to my recycler list, see where we have item 0, item 1, item 2. So what's going to happen is we're going to read from the database, and we are going to, for each restaurant in the database, have a name and a rating that will show, and those will be placed into each of these items. So if we have 100 items, it's going to show 100 of them. It won't just be 10 like it is here. These are really just placeholders. And yes, so there was also in the group chat that some of the systems are complaining about they're too small for touch. That's going to be fine. It won't. It's a warning. It's not an error. Over time. All right. So we've got our layouts files are completed now. And what we need to do is we now need to connect it all together. And in the slides, I had mentioned that we need this idea of an adapter that's going to allow us to get our data and attach it to these layouts. Because it's kind of like a layout within a layout. So we need an adapter to handle that for us. So I'm going to go up here into my Java section. I'm going to right click and say new Kotlin class. And I'm going to call this the recycler view adapter. Okay, so again, the way I did that, went up here under Java to that same package as everything else, right click, new Kotlin class, and called it recycler view adapter. This is the hardest part of today's class, and once we get through it, you'll be like, that's not that bad. Hopefully. So this particular class is really going to make us think about what does it really look like in Java, where it's maybe more comfortable, or at least for me, it helped. So in Java, if I go back here to IntelliJ stuff, okay. So we talked about the idea of a subclass, and in Kotlin, when we define the parent class, we put colon and we say what the parent class is. In this case, it's going to be a recycler view dot adapter. Okay, so the parent class here is recycler view adapter. And in Kotlin, we can define our instance variables and our constructor and our class definition kind of all in one line. So if you remember in our restaurant class, let's go there for a second. In our restaurant class, this one line of code serves as our constructor, our instance variables, and actually will trigger get and set methods should we want them. Okay, so the way we do is it's the class, there's our class name, and then in here is where we're defining all of our instance variables. Same thing is true here. So when I put these brackets, I can pass in all of my arguments, and those will also serve as some instance variables for this adapter class. So I'm going to say val context, and that is of type context. And the other one is we need a list of restaurants. Okay. So our class is called recycler view. When we create an instance of our class, we need to pass in the context. Context is the activity that's calling it, and a list of restaurants. And it's extending the recycler view dot adapter class. And this adapter class that it's going to extend is going to hold, and this is where it feels like you're going in circles a bit, a recycler view adapter dot restaurant view holder. And we haven't created that type of class yet. We're going to do that right now. So it will show an error for now. So if your mind's bending a bit, don't worry, it's okay. We're building a class. It takes in the context, which is just whatever activity we're in, and a list of restaurants, and it extends the recycler view adapter class. That's at a high level all we're doing. So I'm going to say inner class restaurant view holder. Okay. So this is an inner class, right? So you can define a class within another class. And it only lives really when this recycler view adapter is created. And what this is doing is it's going to connect. Remember, we have that item view, that restaurant item view file, this one here. So this view holder holds this view. Good naming convention. So everything in these different layout files is called a view. So the fact that we have an XML file that's going to hold this other XML file, that's the idea of this view holder. Okay, so we're creating this view holder object so that we can access those elements. So I'm going to say create a variable here, name text view. Okay, so we created our own custom inner class here. And what happens is, yes, we're recording. That's the little pause button down here. So yes, thank you. Always good to remind me just in case. I have missed before, but no, we're good for now. In here, what this is our adapter, okay? Our recycler view adapter needs to have a particular, they're calling it a view holder, but it's a way to access those elements that are nested inside here. And that's all that this is doing. So when we say item view, so that item XML file is passed in, and then we say find view by ID, and it looks up the name text field, which if we go into here is the ID for the text field, right? It's name text field or name text view. And similarly for the rating bar. So this find view by ID was actually how you used to find all the items in your entire application. But there's some inefficiencies with it. So they had switched to that view binding technique. where we now use a binding class. But that binding class doesn't work when you have like nested XML files. So that's why we create our own custom view holder class. Once we get this all put together, I'm going to show you that when you change to a different type of recycler view, there's actually very little that you have to change here. A lot of this is boilerplate stuff. So when we created our recycler view adapter, right? So this custom class we're building is a recycler view adapter class. That's the parent class. There are certain abstract methods we have to implement, and that's why it's underlining this part here in red. So if I put my cursor up here, hold down Alt and hit Enter, if I say implement the members, you can see there's 3 methods that have to be created. So I'm going to say OK, and it will put them down here. And what these to-dos basically means that if you don't fill that in, it triggers an exception. So we have to fill those in. So I'm going to go with the easiest one first. So in our class, when we defined it, we passed in a list of restaurant objects. And this method down here says get item count. So how many restaurants do we have? Well, we just have to return the list of restaurants. So restaurants dot size. That method's done. See? Now you can all go, oh, you know what? This isn't that complicated. So that's pretty easy. We know how many items we need to iterate over now. And then we've got our custom view holder here. So what we need to do is now with this, where it says on create view holder. So it passes in the view group. So basically our layouts. And let's just see here. So when the onCreateViewHolder method runs, basically what's created is an instance of our restaurant view holder. Okay, so we've got now an instance of this view holder class, and here we're going to bind it to our actual restaurant object. So so we get our restaurant object, restaurant. So in the parent class, it's obviously looping over all of these items, right? It's going through all the amount of whatever our item count was, and it'll pass in a number. So first it's going to pass in position 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and grab each of these restaurants. And we're going to say with. So maybe it's easier if I call this the view holder. Right, so that custom class that we created with the view holder. And when you say with, it's sort of a fancy, shorter way. Instead of saying view holder dot name text view dot text, it sort of shortcuts it. So I'll show it to you both ways so you know what it's doing. But now I can access these variables directly. So text equals now the rating bar needs a float. So it can't handle an integer, which is what we originally started with. So we're putting it, I'll just say here, to float. And that is our adapter class. Pretty easy, right? At the end of the day, when you start looking at these, if you look at them enough, what you'll see is you're passing in a list of whatever your object is. So that's the only thing that really changes there. And here, you don't even technically need the name restaurant view holder or object view holder or whatever you're trying to model. You could just call it view holder. This class just reflects whatever's in your XML layout. So there's not much there. In here, the only thing that changes is your item XML file name, right? So there's actually very little that's changing from item to item. And then here, again, it just depends on what's in your layout file as to what you change there. But otherwise, it's always kind of the same. And I recognize that it's a new, like looking at it, because it's like looking in Kotlin, which is a different syntax, it can be a little overwhelming, but there's not a lot of things that are actually changing here. So if your with isn't working, make sure that your argument name matches. And the other way of writing this, so I'll comment this out for a second here. The other way of writing this is I could just say view holder dot name text view text equals restaurant name. So this is equivalent. I just have to keep putting the word view holder at the front of it. And if that's easier for you to read, then do it that way. There you go. So you can write it this way or this way. They're doing the exact same thing. And in this case, I'm really just saving the word view holder once. It's not a big savings, but if you had a bunch of these, it just makes it a little cleaner looking. Okay, so we got our adapter. Let's connect this thing up and then pray that it works and take a quick break. So to hook it up, I'm going to go into my recycler list activity class that we created. Yeah, if there's a quick question, let me get this connected and then we can tackle questions. Okay, so here we've already set up our binding, which is great. So on the create, we're going to get our data from the view model. Get data from the view model. And then I'm just going to say view model, get restaurants. So now I have my list of restaurants. See how easy that is now? And I'm going to observe. The context is this. And that gives me a list of restaurants. And what we're going to do now is we're going to use our adapter. So I'm going to say, what did we call it? Recycler view adapter. Recycler view adapter equals. So I'm going to create an instance of our recycler view adapter now. So I pass in the context of this, so this activity, and the list of restaurants that we already have, which is currently being called it. So I'm going to call it restaurants. So it's a little easier to read. And then all we have to do is say binding vertical recycler view adapter equals this adapter. So remember, when we created our custom adapter class, we said we'd have to pass in the context and a list of restaurants, right? So in our adapter, if I switch back, remember we said we're going to pass in the context and a list of restaurants. That's all we're doing here. And then using my binding class, I grab the recycler view from my layout file, and I say the adapter equals that custom adapter we made. And now to see this piece of grandness, all we have to do is update our Android manifest to point to this activity instead of our other activity. So I'll go to the manifest file, and here's our recycler list activity up here. For me, it's on line 12 through 14. So I'm going to close that off, just changing the closing tag style. And then I have to move the intent filter up. Okay. Space it a bit, make it easy to read. So now when it loads, my recycler list activity will be the first one that's called. It's doing lots of building. And it comes up, and here's our recycler list view with all of our restaurant names and their associated star rating showing. So that's pretty cool, right? Like I know there's a few steps there, but now when we come back from break, we're going to do it in a grid view. And what you'll see is not much changes to do it in a grid view. And it's very powerful layout capability for us. So let's take this as our break. I've got 2:04